everyone, Gaijin Goombah here. Sorry this took so long to get out. If you can't tell by hearing me talk, Aki, my entire household got extremely sick between Thanksgiving and, well, the release of Godzilla Minus One. In fact, when I went to go see this with my buddy Noah, I was not feeling all that great. So if I sound a little disjointed and my thoughts are a little bit all over the place, I apologize ahead of time for that. So before I get into the real meat of what I want to talk about in this video, I do have to say a couple things about this movie, because first of all, you should go see this. Even if you've never watched a Godzilla movie, if you have any interest in Japan whatsoever, please go watch this movie. Because I'll say it again later in this video, and I'm gonna say it right now. You could take the Godzilla element out of this movie in its entirety, and it would be a fantastic movie. Like a period fiction piece. It's just, it's just really good. Like, I don't say this lightly, but the human element in this movie is the best human element out of any kaiju movie, period. Whether it be from Japan or the US, I don't care. This has the best human element, so you're never gonna be bored when you sit down and watch this movie. The other thing I'll say too is that you never see any sort of like really gory things happen to anyone. But man, the violent horror in this movie is probably the strongest it's ever been that I've seen in any Godzilla movie. Usually people, you see people falling off buildings way in the background, they're a little indistinguishable, or some guy gets blasted in the face with Godzilla's atomic breath or something like that. No, this is it's a bit more visceral than that in this movie. You do see people getting crushed and thrown about and ragdolled really hard. There's no gore, but oh, the sounds. So, if that kind of thing bothers you, you might want to be careful, but this is a PG-13 movie. No one's torn in half visually. It's actually Jurassic Parkian in nature when it comes to its giant monster horror. And finally, I do want to say that, holy cow, this movie has a ton of references, and I mean a ton of references. My buddy Noah, who I told you about that I saw this movie with, he is an ultra Godzilla fan, like ultra Godzilla fan. And it felt like every 10 minutes he was pulling me aside, he's like, hey Gaijin, this is from that, and this is from that. I'm like, that's really cool, dude. Like, I don't want people to think that, oh, I've never seen a Godzilla movie before, so all these references are going to be really put offish. No. I'm a fan of Godzilla, but I've not seen everything, and there were so many things that either I knew or didn't know that were in this, so if you're a Godzilla fan, you're gonna love it. If you're not a Godzilla fan, you're still gonna love it. And that's basically all I wanted to say about this movie before I really start getting into cultural, analytical spoilers, as it were. But I'm gonna say one thing before I get started. Please go check out Boxu. I know I'm a terrible shill when it comes to these guys, but I love them. So they're not even paying me to say this. Like, I'm gonna be sneaking some bites from this Soka Senbei because I just freaking love it. Link in the description. Use code Gaijin15, get 15 bucks off your purchase. You know the drill. They're not paying me to say this, but it's such a good product. Please check them out. Okay, before I get into too many historical details, because I will be referencing a lot of those in this videos, I'm just gonna say right now, I'm not gonna give a whole lot of specific dates, a lot of technical examples, anything like that. If you want that, go check out Kraut. He's done probably the best comprehensive work when it came to Japan as it led up into World War II and then the aftermath thereof. A bit of an older video, but it's really good. Go check that out if you really want the specifics. I'm just going to be taking bits and pieces of what happened in that historical time period to kind of give some context about why Godzilla Minus One is just really this freaking good. Now, the one thing that I've seen a lot of people ask when it came to this movie is, why is it called Godzilla Minus One? What does the minus one even mean? And it's the idea that during World War II, Japan had lost everything. And I mean everything. And with the coming of Godzilla, they're now in the negatives. That's what the minus one is. The appearance of Godzilla and all of the carnage that he's wreaking is the minus one part. Because in this movie, despite it being around the last part of World War II and the immediate aftermath thereof, there's no US intervention, which doesn't make any sense historically, but I understand why they did it, because if there was US intervention, there would be no movie. Or they would be like, let's nuke it, like they did in Shin Godzilla. Ugh. But the weird thing is that there's no Japanese government intervention in this movie. And I didn't understand why that was until I really thought about it later on, and once I explain it, it's gonna make a lot more sense. but it's this idea that Japan as a people are standing on their own. They're getting no government aid. So with the emergence of Godzilla and no government help, the people are actually kind of at a negative. The whole idea with this movie is that it's the average everyday people that are having to deal with Godzilla and also how to fight him. So anyway, let me address what I was kind of alluding to in this thumbnail over here, and that's, how did Japan lose everything? Well, to answer that question, we have to talk about what Japan had before World War II, and in order to do that, we gotta talk about the Tai Show period. Now, during this time, in the 1920s, Japan had so much going for it on a modern cultural level. I mean, you had the post-Meiji Restoration, you had the creation of a more Western-style government, rather than it being completely centralized around a daimyo, a shogun, or the emperor himself, or anything like that. You had a cabinet, you had a structured system. And with that structured system of government, even more Western ideas and concepts and goods and art and all different kinds of Western things were permeating their way into Japan. Like, one of the best examples I could think of were these guys right here. These are Modon Garu, or like Moga, or Mogo. Japan, why do you take English words and then like chop them into pieces and then put them together and make other words? But anyway, these are, quote, modern girls, and they're basically the Japanese equivalent of flappers. And for anyone who doesn't know what flappers are, they're basically women who were really, really out there. They dressed provocatively for the time, they acted provocatively for the time, but it was basically ladies just trying to be far more progressive. And not only in how they acted and how they dressed, but a woman's role in general society was something that they challenged greatly. And modern gals did that a whole heck of a lot. And it's not just modern girls, it's just like, there was so much art and philosophy, and there was such potential for Japan to turn into this huge sort of mecca of modern culture. But there was one problem with all of that, and it was the military. Prior, during, and after the Boshin War, samurai had been losing a lot of their power over time. As Japan finally became more peaceful, they really didn't have much of a purpose. Basically, what happened during the 70-80 years period of time is that all of the power that the samurai had went to the merchant class, which is like the lowest part of the totem pole when it came to old Japan's social hierarchy. But it was Western fraternization with Japan that was probably the thing that really sealed the deal when it came to the loss of power with the samurai. So you have these militant families who are just constantly shoving their children into the army because they think that that's the only good job they're ever going to get, because anything that is Western is bad. Anything Western is the cause of all of the ills in Japan, so to speak. That's when we have the lead up into everything that happened in World War II. You had the Mukden railway sabotage that led into the invasion of China, that led to parts of its annexation, to Japan just starting to annex the entirety of Asia, whatever they could get their hands on. But the one thing that isn't ever really talked about is that propaganda taught us that the average everyday person in Japan was 100% behind this warrior mentality. But we know that that's not true because of all the evidence during the Tai Show period of 1920s modernity in Japan. That's not how things were. That's how they become that way. Because over time, the military of Japan slowly took over the government. Long story short, they straight up assassinated either prime ministers, other cabinet members, any sort of government official who was pro-democracy, pro-West. They would just openly execute them. And then when it came to the court hearing of those murders, the extremists, the militant hyper-nationalist extremists would use that as a platform to spread the word about ultra-nationalism when it came to Japan. And they were allowed to get away with that because you had underground societies all over Japan who would actually threaten juries or judges to make sure that this message could get out, and then their sentences were basically nothing for murder. And what eventually happened is that the military not only dragged the government into this militarized mentality, it dragged the people into this militarized mentality. That the whole idea behind the Japanese people is that they should serve the military. The military shouldn't serve the government. The government and the people should serve the military. And so what ended up happening is that there was such a big push for all Japanese men to join in the military, for the women to throw all of their efforts behind that. And then after the attack of Pearl Harbor, the US gets involved, we fight Japan, things go very, very, very poorly for Japan, and the thing that never gets talked about is how this devastated average everyday people. So at this point, I'm sure you're asking, Gaijin, what the heck does this have to do with Godzilla Minus One? And the answer I have to that is everything. You need to understand the context, the historical context of what happened in the 1920s to the late 1940s in Japan to understand why this particular movie is so freaking moving. Because this movie is just so anti-war. So anti-war. Now, I understand that, granted, Godzilla, even its earliest iteration, has always been anti-war, anti-nuclear, so on and so forth, but this movie takes it in such an extreme direction. Because, like I said before, you could take Godzilla completely out of this movie, and it would still be an absolute banger, because you are looking directly at the aftermath of the decimation of Japan. Not from a military standpoint, but from a civilian standpoint. The movie opens up, everything is gone. I mean, Noah was like, oh man, this is a whole lot like Fallout, and I'm like, yeah, it was. Because see, the one thing that people don't realize is just how much more damage the firebombings did to Japan versus the nuke. Don't get me wrong, tens of thousands of people in Japan, civilian people in Japan, died from the nukes, but hundreds of thousands of people in Japan died from all of the bombings and firebombings and so on that were done prior to the nukes. And you see that devastation in this movie from the absolute get-go. You see people stumbling around in a daze trying to figure out how to pick up the pieces. People talking about all of their family dying. And even before all that, we're introduced to Koichi Shikishima, who is this failed kamikaze pilot who's just living with this horrible shame that he couldn't do his job that the military was pushing him to do. And supposedly because of his cowardice, it cost the lives of all of these technicians and other soldiers who were out on this little island. I think it was Odo Island, which wasn't a military base. It was just a place where planes would go to essentially get fixed. But there is so much of this element of either regular people or even soldiers who never wanted this, never wanted to get involved in any of this. And I know that for some people that might just sound like Japan trying to play the victim here, but the thing is that the people were the victim, not the military. The military, the official military, is nowhere to be seen in this movie, and that's the whole point. It's like when you look at Japan today in a modern setting and you hear them talk about their disdain for war, you have to understand it's that people in Japan don't hate war because the US won and told them what to do, whatever. They don't hate war because they lost. They hate war because of what the military put the civilians through. You have regular housewives who are being trained with bamboo spears how to charge American soldiers when they inevitably invade the homeland before they die. That's the image that this movie gives you, is that you've got people being dragged into the horrors of war. And I mean, it's really crazy because there are so many different moments in this movie where you see individual examples of this sort of just horrible anti-war mentality, specifically because of the Japanese government, militaristic government during World War II, that were dragging people into these war horrors against a losing war. Like, Japan knew the moment they attacked Pearl Harbor, they were screwed. They had to attack Pearl Harbor because they wanted to get into occupied US territory. So they thought that they could demoralize a fat, lazy American populace. Well, that didn't work out. It just pissed off the US even more. When they figured out that they were going to lose, it was like, how much can we bleed the Americans out and how much of our own sovereign nation can we retain before we lose? I think it was Potential History that put it best. It's like, this is Japan 1945, you're going to die. That is this entire movie. This movie shows and explains the actual mentality of the average everyday person and an average everyday soldier. Not like an officer, but just a regular Joe soldier of Japan during World War II. And I really feel like a lot of this is based off of different memoirs and diary entries from old Japanese World War II pilots and soldiers. Please don't ask me where specifically I read these from. This has been over a very long period of time, but I remember reading how they were just constantly told that you're going to die. Like, as soon as you get in the military, you're going to die. So do something important. That was the instance of every single memoir, every single diary that I ever saw. You're going to die. And I bring that up because there's a specific line in the movie where they're talking about how to take Godzilla down, and this one person says, "So death isn't assured, right?" And then the answer is, "Well, no, there's a chance that everybody's going to be able to come back from this." And the guy said, "Well, at least that's better than the war," and that stuck out so hard. Like, it's a quick little moment where you're supposed to kind of laugh, but when you really think about it, this was a better situation because everyone was told they're going to die. So, like, let me talk about how this movie is extremely anti-Japanese government, because the government's nowhere to be seen at all. I mean, there's also no help from the United States, and it's kind of a weird cop-out how they explained it. It's that MacArthur had to leave and the US has to focus on the uprising of the Soviets at this point. And I'm like, man, you have a multi-story nuke bomb spitting lizard in your backyard right now. I think that's the bigger problem. But I understand if the US was involved, there really wouldn't be that much of a movie. Or they could pull a Shin Godzilla where the US is like, nuke him. And that would be the only response. It wouldn't be the same story. It wouldn't be the everyman struggle story that this movie was trying to explain. But unlike most other Godzilla films, there's no Japanese government intervention. And to go back to Shin, it's like the Japanese government was present in the movie. They were trying to do things in the movie. They were horribly incompetent at it, and that was the whole point. Like, Shin Godzilla was this big commentary piece about how terrible the Japanese government is about getting anything done and taken care of. I mean, I think that was a direct response to the March 11th earthquake, in that it took the government a while to get anything done. In fact, the Yakuza got more done. I'm sorry, I'm ranting on a completely different subject. Ugh. Don't sit in a bar with me, I'll yak your ear off about this kind of stuff. Now, I think there's a very specific reason why the Japanese government is being omitted in this particular story, and it's not just because it was the average everyday person who was not only affected by the horrible policies of the militarized Japanese government during World War II, but also the fact that there was no government for the people to fall back on when World War II was over. They had to rely on themselves. I think a lot of this is coming from the fact that Japan is really starting to build up its military, mostly out of concern for China. In fact, I saw in a couple of news articles, I'll put them up on screen if I can find them, is that Japan has been building up its biggest military force since World War II. That's where I think all these things are starting to connect. Kishida said that there is an official turning point in Japan's history when it comes to military buildup, that this is his answer to various security challenges that they face, aka China. And I really do think that this movie is a criticism of that mentality, because World War II still wasn't really that long ago. There are so many scars that are just burned into people's minds when it comes to war. And despite the fact that, you know, like, military otaku are becoming bigger in Japan, and there is a bit more support for Japan becoming a bit stronger with its own military power, it ain't even close compared to all of the people that are just utterly against war. And the whole point of this movie is to remind everyone of how horrible all of that went. How everything was destroyed and decimated prior to the nukes. Just the regular fire bombings of Tokyo left so many dead, so many homeless. I will try to find either pictures or footage if I can, but it's like Noah said, it looks like fall, because that's what it was. You see main characters, you see Shikima living in a shack of his former home. You hear about how all of his family died during the fire, how his neighbor begrudges him because he didn't complete his kamikaze attack. Like, it's just the sheer desolation on a civilian level is so palpable in this movie, I can't help but think that this is a commentary piece in regards to what Kishida's been up to. Like, two other very specific things that get dropped in this movie are Yokusai and Tokubetsu Koge Kitai. Apologies everyone, it's actually pronounced Gyokusai and Tokubetsu Kogekitai. I have no idea why I pronounced these the way that I did, but it just goes to show you always need to double check your work. Sorry everyone. And the earlier, Yokusai, that was basically just a suicide charge. Back when the US was island hopping, anyone who could stand would fight to the very last man. The order was, I think it was like, kill 5 Americans before being killed yourself. It's a literal desperation attack, and that is a monumentally horrible thing to think about on the humanist level. To, again, be told you're going to die, make something of your life before you are killed in battle. And then you've got the Tokubetsu Koge Kitai, which is just Japan's official name for kamikaze attacks, pilots, and so on and so forth. But it's like, those things, those themes are brought up in name and in symbolism. Like I said at the very beginning, the main character, Shikima, is a failed kamikaze pilot. The movie is trying to remind you of just how awful things were when Japan was at war. The level of sacrifice, the level of a forced hand of the militaristic government that got pushed onto the average everyday people. I know I'm repeating myself, but again, I think that all of this entire movie, the entirety of Godzilla Minus One, is a commentary on all of this military buildup going on in Japan and all of Kishida's policies. So anyway, that's the big thing that I want to talk about, but there's so much more that I still really feel like needs addressed in a cultural sense with this movie, and one of them is the whole concept of the nuclear weapons that were used against Japan. Because the funny thing is that unlike every other iteration of Godzilla where he would shoot out like an atomic beam, atomic breath, whatever, that was an obvious symbolism to the damage that was caused by all of the nukes that were dropped in Japan. Here's the thing, in this movie, Godzilla shoots a nuke. Like, there's no ambiguity about it. When he's charging up, when his horns on his back are clicking into place and lighting up, and it looks like an actual weapon, by the way. It's not that his scales just kind of glow and it's a mechanism clicks out and out and out and out, and it just looks like this mix of a biological weapon and a mechanical weapon. The most harrowing point in this movie was when that first happens, because he shoots it out, this thing explodes, and there is an actual mushroom cloud, and Godzilla is standing in front of it, looking at it, arms out, roaring. What felt like triumph. And that was... I don't know how else to put it. It was harrowing. And then immediately after that, there's this quick little montage of debris testing and all these people in suits, and it's like, oh my god, this is the actual bomb. This is the actual bomb going off. And as soon as that mushroom cloud goes up, and Godzilla's over there roaring about it, you've got Shikishima, who just lost Noriko to that explosion, on his knees, screaming, crying as black rain falls. And that, oh my god, that imagery. For those of you that don't know the sequence of things that happened when Hiroshima and Nagasaki were nuked, is that after the bomb went off and the mushroom cloud went up, there was a black rain that fell because you had radiated particles and ash going into the sky, intermixing with the atmosphere and dropping it back down in a radiated rain. And you know, this is something that's kind of small and maybe not worth mentioning, but it's something that really stuck with me, in that this entire movie is dealing with one man's survivor's guilt. Like, this whole movie is dealing with Shikishima's survival guilt, that not only did he survive being a kamikaze pilot, he also survived the attack on Odo Island. Odoshima? He survived the initial attack that Godzilla brought in that wiped out everyone who was on that island except for him. Throughout this entire movie, he's constantly asking himself, am I actually alive? Am I actually dead? Am I allowed to have happiness? Or when tragedy finally strikes, like I said, when Noriko is taken from him and his found family is eviscerated, he's sitting there telling himself that he didn't deserve this new kind of life. And I find that to be really interesting, because if you know anything about Japan as a society, you know that mental health is not something that's really looked into and paid attention to very closely. Like, for as much as Japan has really great healthcare, mental health care is extremely bad. I'm sorry, Japan, but it is. There are great strides to try and improve that, especially with the epidemic of hikikomori, but it's still not in a good place. People are either shunting it, they are ignoring it, they are saying that it's something else, oh, people are lazy. Like, it fascinated me that this movie spent so much time, who put a central focus on a mental illness. And then Godzilla's design in itself I thought was really interesting, because similar to Shin Godzilla, which was just, yeah, this thing is a walking cancerous tumor, they did a very nice mix of classic Godzilla and like ultra cancer, as Noah put it, Godzilla in this movie. And again, super spoilers, I'm about to drop the ending. At the very end of the movie, when it's found out that Noriko actually survived the atomic bomb that Godzilla dropped in Tokyo, you actually see that she has starting symptoms of acute radiation syndrome. And after Godzilla's head's explode and he's like sinking into the ocean, you see him start to regenerate and burst back out, but it's not like the original kind of regeneration where it's like the tissue is just coming back. It's like these tumors are bloating out and then reforming from that. And I know that's a very obvious allegory to all of the sickness and disease and other horrible illnesses that occurred after the nuking, after all of the fallout had spread throughout the populace. But I feel like it hit harder than Shin Godzilla did, especially because you had such a bittersweet ending. Like, I know Noah was kind of upset that, oh, well, the love interest is brought back to life, so to speak, and it's like, I actually like hopeful ends like that. But then the camera pans over, it's like, oh god, she's got tumor skin. And it's like, oh god, like, you just feel bad. And I guess I want to end this gigantic ramble of a cultural review for this movie with something that touched on me on an even more personal level, and it's that I'm really sad that Japan feels alone. Like, again, I understand why the US government could not intervene with the appearance of ultra-radiation Godzilla just after World War II, when they very rightly should. That was, we were the occupied force at the time. We really should do something about that. We should just pack up and say, oh no, the Soviets are up to no good. It's just, in so many natural disaster movies in Japan, and there's a lot of them, there's always this feeling that they are alone all the time. And it's not that I take offense to that, it's that I feel really sad that I know there are a lot of people in Japan that feel that way, that because they are an island nation of just constant, consistent natural disasters, that they are on their own, when they're not. Like, that's the best example I could think of is the March 11th earthquake in 2011. I was in Japan for that. Like, I wasn't anywhere close to the epicenter. I was all the way in Mie. I was far and away from Tohoku. Like, the worst that happened for me is that I felt the initial tremors of when the earthquake actually happened. I felt the aftershocks, and that did scare me a little bit. And not only did I want to offer myself to help, but there were so many other ALTs, so many other jets, so many other foreigners in Japan that wanted to directly go to the site to help. And we were turned away. Not for any malicious reason. I mean, the people were very rightfully worried about there being a language barrier, about instructions not being able to be correctly relayed to people who were trying to assist. But my point is that foreigners that were living in Japan wanted to help because it was still our home too. Maybe that sounds bad to some people, like that's not actually your home, but no, it was. We had friends, we had people we considered family suffer from that and countless other natural disasters, and we want to be a part of our community that we are living in and help. And that doesn't even bring into account all of the external help that came in during the March 11th earthquake. I mean, you had humanitarian efforts from Australia, India, New Zealand, South Korea, and just dozens of other countries. Big or small, there was an effort to help Japan. I think in total there was like $3.5 million that were just donated on top of all of the rescue efforts and supplies. I mean, you had the U.S. Operation Tomodachi Saksen or Operation Friend. I hate that I see this, and it's not because I feel like we're left out and that's not fair. It's that I'm sad that in so much Japanese media, when a big natural disaster like that happens, and Godzilla is a representation of a natural disaster on top of being a nuclear disaster, Japan is always alone. And I get that for this movie, the whole point of it was to emphasize the fact that the Japanese people were alone. Civilians were alone in this. They didn't have a government to fall back on. In fact, it was the government that got them into this in the first place. And so many people are terrified now that when it comes to Kishida's policies and this military buildup that is that's going to be potentially fighting off China, maybe in the future. It makes me sad, man. You know, Japan, you ain't alone. Mazide zensen hitori janai. I don't know. That's just something that stuck with me. Like, this whole movie stuck with me. That's why I think, like, if you have any mild interest in Japan or Japanese history, this contextualizes what happened in Japan so well, despite it being fiction. Very fiction. With the elements of Godzilla and whatnot. But the core of it, I would say, is a documentary. A really, really good one, too. So, if you ever wondered what Japan was like actually like, after World War II, and the real mentality of the actual people that survived it, this is probably one of the best movies. And don't get me wrong, if you like Godzilla destruction movies, if you like natural disaster movies, you're gonna like this too. Dad, if you're watching this, you would like this movie. Trust me on that one. But that's pretty much all I got. It hit home so hard, man. Please go watch it. It deserves your time and attention. Also, you know what else deserves your time and attention? Freaking Boxu! They're still not paying me to promote them. I just love these guys this much. So anyway, more regular content to come. I appreciate you sitting through this. This video is probably going to be a half hour long. Hopefully I'll get better before then. I'm still working out this cold. My mind is starting to fall to pieces. So I'm just going to go ahead and end it here. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. And until next time, this is Gaijin Goombah, signing out.